We were always told not to venture out on Werewolf Road late at night when we were children, but one night we were just too damn determined to know why the teenagers from our small town were so frightened by the unnerving place that we had to see it ourselves. I had my small backpack loaded with snacks, a flashlight with spare batteries, a flare gun with a can of bear spray, and attached to my backpack was my sleeping bag. The four of us gathered together behind my cousin's house, who lived just 2 houses down across the street, and together we all exchanged scary legends and stories we had heard about the road and the cemetery on it. I heard there's a woman in the trees who jumps on people's cars late at night. She sleeps on a mattress with her dead, rotting baby, Evan said with a morbid sense of pride in his voice. That's baloney, my cousin Justin said, shaking his head. I heard she was just drunk and that happened once. The baby wasn't dead. The police took it from her, though, he said in a matter-of-fact tone. You guys ever heard about the dead puppy in the box my brother found in the cemetery? I said out loud. The other 3 looked at me, their eyes widening with interest as I spoke up. He said we went up there alone one day, around 2 years ago, when we moved here. He said he was walking through the graveyard and near one of the tombstones there was a purple box. He saw blood on the outside of the box and grabbed a stick to open it, and there was a dead puppy that someone had sacrificed. He looked up and saw streamers in the trees, and an area where it looked like there was a fire. For 4 adolescent boys with active imaginations, you could only picture how terrified we were. There would have been next to no possibility that we would venture out anywhere such as that alone. But together, it was a different story. We were all in this together, despite how frightening it was. Oh, come on. He's just jacking with you, Ronnie, the youngest of us 4, spouted. I could tell he was lying, and believe me, he wasn't. He had a look on his face that made me feel like he wasn't. We gonna do this or not? Johnny said, seemingly irritated by the stories. We each shrugged and picked up our belongings, and next thing we knew, we were walking towards the road that led to the legendary road on the other side. The leaves and sticks cracked beneath our feet as we stumbled along the pitch-black summer night. Justin had his flashlight shining ahead of our group. The narrow beam shone the heavy thicket that surrounded us. In some places you could see, even in the absence of light, the silhouettes of fast food litter like styrofoam cups of various sizes, and plastic bottles or discarded cans that were scattered about. I felt the crunch of an empty beer can under my foot. I cursed under my breath as I realized just how loud and inconvenient my misstep was. Evan turned around and shushed me as we continued walking. "Fuck off, Evan," I said in a stern but quiet voice. I raised my hand as he turned forward, the thought crossing my mind to smack the back of his head. I bit my bottom lip and considered how bad that could be for us if the wrong group of people noticed our presence. Okay, I see the road. We need to decide right now if we're going to drop our stuff off first and then continue, or if we're going to take everything, Justin said. I looked around at the flat, dry ground that was covered in leaves nearby. That looks like a perfect area to set up camp, I said, pointing at the spot. We all 4 removed our bags as we walked over to the grounds I chose, setting them down. Anything valuable any of you might need to grab before we go? Justin asked. I raised my bag and grabbed the bear spray, assuming it would be good just in case we ran into some trouble. I ran to my bag and grabbed my bear spray, assuming it would be good just in case we ran into some trouble. Ronnie and Evan shook their heads and continued with him as he moved his flashlight from off our newly claimed campsite and headed for the cemetery on Werewolf Road. I quickly caught up to them as we continued. In the humid summer night, there wasn't a sound to be heard, besides a barn owl that could be heard in a tree nearby, and our feet lightly moved across the earth. We reached the dirt road, and I raised my head and looked around as what sounded like something heavy fell through a mess of branches, perhaps a decrepit tree or a large animal. Whatever that was, it wasn't small, I heard Ronnie say. I looked over at him and was leaning over his bent knees, wiping his sweaty face off with his dark shirt. He raised up and shook it, attempting to cool off. We four sat in silence. The night now grew more ominous. We stared at the dirt road, and I now looked to the right, remembering the wooden bridge that led to the cemetery. "It's this way," I said. We continued walking. I turned around to notice the rest of the group beside me. I turned around to see the rest of the group behind me. Justin still holding the flashlight, but aiming it up in the trees rather than the very dark road ahead. "Justin, can I see the flashlight?" I asked. "There you go," he said as he quickly stretched his arm out and held it out like the Olympic torch. We approached the wooden bridge. As we came closer, I looked out at the creek, where you could see a pile of dead hogs, perhaps 6 or more, on the creek bed. The stench from their rotting, bloated corpses fouled the air. On the bridge was a pentagram, drawn out near the very center. It had been faded from the elements, but you could still see it fairly well. We gathered around it, not saying a thing aloud. "The cemetery is just up the road," I said. We continued across the bridge, and I noticed that Ronnie turned his head and looked back at the creek where the dead hogs were. "Did you guys see that? Or smell it, at least?" We continued walking, not thinking too much about it. There could have been many reasons for that. Not even little things had to be unusual, even to young boys who longed for excitement. As we got closer to the cemetery, we noticed a bright light coming from inside its fence. It was a fire. We rushed down the road, trying our best to stay low and keep quiet as we grew dangerously closer to the cemetery. We got off the road and made our way up to a ditch, which led us into the woods that surrounded the cemetery fence line. As we lined up to peer through the fence, we were careful to stay low. Embers lingered about the blaze like fireflies in the cemetery landscape, and we watched as these beings gathered around the fire. They weren't human. There hadn't been a chance they were human at all. They were beastly, savage creatures that were swift on all fours. When they were on the lookout, they stood on their hind legs and perched, exposing their ape-like chests and torsos. The rest of their bodies looked more canine, like a greyhound. Their faces were covered in heavy, bleak masks that looked similar to the surgeon masks worn during the Black Plague. But these were more of a ghastly sight on such already terrifying monsters. I knew we couldn't dare trespass on their fiery territory. I watched as one lurked near a tombstone and dug like a canine into the ground. I listened as we could hear what sounded like gurgling coming from the plot, dirt being thrown viciously behind the creature. The rest of the pack began to gurgle and click their mouths as they walked around the fire. 3 other creatures gathered near the burial plot where the first creature dug, and the other 3 stood on their hind legs and looked around. I watched as the creature that was now buried deep in the ground climbed out of the hole. I watched as the creature that was now burrowed deep in the ground climbed out of the hole with a rotting arm in its mouth. It sat next to the others, arms between its 2 hands, sniffling. The others gurgled and sniffed in between chirps. Another creature crawled into the hole and came back to the surface with a dismembered leg in its mouth and carried it away from the rest of the group. Justin looked over at the rest of us with a face full of shock as he spoke very hesitantly in an almost faint whisper, trying his best to control his breathing. "We've got to get the hell out of here. I don't know what those things are, but they aren't people. I say we leave our stuff in the campsite and get back to my place, fast." The 4 of us backed away from the fence as we got as close to the bottom of the ditch as we could. We knew that any little noise from us could be fatal. The sticky summer air attracted unrelenting mosquitoes that swarmed around our ears and our sweaty necks and arms. We tried for our lives to ignore the high-pitched buzz that rang in our ears as we crept towards the bridge. I heard a gurgling sound in a nearby tree overhead. It rattled and clicked, signaling the others to move in on us. I looked up to see it as, through its frightening mask that covered its disfigured face, it looked down on me with its black, dilated pupils. As I felt the sweat collect in my eyes and the mosquitoes I refused to away at bite into my neck. The other three were frozen in place, staring at the creature as well. I smelled urine in the air from Ronnie, as he couldn't anymore hold his bladder in fear. I couldn't blame him. There wasn't a moment for ridicule or disparagement. The creature stared into our eyes, and I heard the fence line viciously rattle as the other creatures climbed and jumped in, closing in on our misfortunate, desperate souls. Justin spoke up. "Guys, any ideas?" I slowly reached into my pocket and felt for a lighter. In my other pocket was the big can of bear spray. We let them close in on us dangerously to our discomfort, but I knew this was an ample opportunity to quickly discharge as much of the can on them as I could, while we still had a chance. I watched as the creatures fell on their backs, croaking and clicking their tongues with this very awful and loud scream that came out in between gurgles and rattles. They nervously clicked more after this. The creatures in their tree appeared to fear jumping. It leapt in the opposite direction, scurrying near the cemetery fire. We quickly rushed across the bridge. We jumped into the creek near the dead hogs and trudged to the water. It was only 5 minutes or less to Justin's home, the time we counted down together, not allowing failure to escape the grip of such vile and heinous of creatures. We saw the porch light nearby as we entered into the neighborhood. It had been a welcome relief to know that we had arrived. As I reached Justin's patio under the floodlight, I took a moment to catch my breath. I turned my head to look around, and I realized I had been the only one who reached my cousin's backyard. I called out each of their names, but without success. I waited around 5 minutes when I saw the beam of Justin's flashlight shine into the backyard from over the fence. I watched as him and Evan and Ronnie boosted each other over his fence as I continued to walk over to them and asked them what exactly kept them so long. I watched them, and something seemed different about their demeanors. They each had a look in their eyes that unnerved me. Justin spoke up. "You left us behind. You didn't even let us catch up with you. What the hell were you thinking?" he said angrily. I walked in circles, looking up at the three of them as they stared at me, with unequivocal disapproval nonetheless. After the three of them refused to talk to me that night, I finally decided to walk home. As I got to my room, I quickly stripped to my boxers and fell onto my bed. I woke up around 8:30 in the morning to my father calling out to me from his office, and he said, "Tyler, come in here right now." I walked into my father's office. I watched as he held his balled fist over his mouth. Leaning back in his chair, he ran his other hand through his hair and looked at me. "Your cousins and friends are missing. What happened last night?" I thought about it for a moment, but hesitated on giving a full disclosure. "We just hung out until early this morning, and then I came home around 11 o'clock this morning. They were there when I left." "Did you go anywhere with them? Or did they have somewhere they wanted to go?" He leaned forward. "The only place we went to was the cemetery on Werewolf Road."
I want to tell my story, even if no one will believe me. As long as it helps someone, this text will have a purpose. This is a very famous site, so I should be able to prevent someone from making the same mistake, or to help those in my situation. Some time ago I was surfing the deep web. As usual, I was looking for gruesome stories to share. There were always strange sights, but they had never intimidated me with their design. That day I ran into a forum. At first glance, it gave me the impression of a cult. I defined them cliches, so I went ahead without thinking too much. There was only one section, called Prayers. From the titles I would guess that they were dedicated to the stars, but most were dedicated to the moon. I decided to read one. It said their body was lit up. It would give life to what is inanimate, while it would take it from the rest. I returned to the homepage and wrote on the main chat. Despite the post being outdated, the chat was active. The last message was from the day before, the 6th of March 2019. A user had asked, "How will you celebrate this week?" I joined saying, "I think I'll pray the moon." The chat started flooding with messages from disappointed users. Someone replied, "You should know that when the crescent moon appears, you must stay in silence. How did you find the cult?" I was scared. The people in this site sent me creepy vibes. But my fear got out of control with their next message. "Anyway, you're now part of it. In or out of this site, it doesn't matter." I logged out and closed the browser. It took me a while to calm down, but I managed. A few days later a package had arrived. Inside there was a candle and a sheet of paper. The last item had a URL written on it that I typed in the browser that night. It was a secret section of the forum. How to summon the lunar being. There was written that in order to do it, the person had to light a black candle near a window or over a fireplace for 3 nights during the crescent moon. Usually, the being watches people for all this period. Because of its ability to multiply, it doesn't leave alone any of the victims. Panicking, I searched for the normal forum. It was gone. I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen, where I opened the package. I threw the candle in the trash and covered it with some plastic bags. The same night I had nightmares about a deformed figure who stood still staring at me, a few inches from my bed. When I woke up, I stayed up the rest of the night thinking. I fell asleep at 12 p.m, and at night, the 10th of March 2019, I went visiting a family's friend with my parents. At that time, he was working for an old lady who lived in a house in front of a beach. When I entered, I immediately noticed a candle left on the fireplace. It was identical to the one I received. I tried to get some information out of my parents, asking why it was there. They said they gave it to her as a gift. They took it from the trash, as it was new and clean. Before going back to the car, I noticed a crooked figure standing on the beach. Looking at the sky, I suddenly felt like gravity got heavier. The next day went on normally, but I fell asleep later and woke up deep in the night. I was hearing very loud noises from the kitchen. I went to check and saw the candle on the windowsill, off and smoking. I panicked. I took a few steps back, but what I saw left me without words. Another lit black candle near the veranda's door, and a humanoid white being with a lunar-shaped head. It was standing behind it. I passed out. From the moment I woke up, I couldn't speak, smile, express emotions nor move. If not a bit. I spent the whole day in bed. At night, the being returned. It remained still in front of the door staring at me, from the opening he had in the place of his eyes. After the 12th, there was a pause. After that, it returned on the 6th of April. I believe it disappears with the first quarter of the moon, but from the 5th of May, it's here again. Every night it gets closer to me. I don't know what I'll do, but I don't have any energy left. This was the last bit. I hope others can be saved.